Hey everyone, Totem God here, and welcome to another build guide. Today we're going to be talking about the Eye of Winter Totem Hierophant, and like normal, I'm going to be giving you a bit about why we're doing this build, and then I'm going to run you through a map, show you how the build functions, and if you want to stop there, there'll be a PoE in the description, so you can go ahead and replicate the build if you're a more experienced player. If you want to stick around, hear the methodology, the explanation, etc., or maybe if you're newer and you're not quite familiar how all this works and you want to get a better handle on things, feel free to stick around as well. I'm going to go into like a longer form where I break down the build and discuss things piece by piece. So we'll get right into it. Basically, I just, long-time Diablo 2 fan, love Frozen Orb. Seen they were making Eye of Winter, and I was like, hey, this is, looks pretty cool. I was kind of unimpressed with the visuals, but then they added the Celestial skin. It looks a lot better, and I wanted to give it a try. Initially, it seems like it might be better on self-cast, because it's clearly a skill where you want to, like, target things more. Something like that, or mines. Obviously, you could do traps, but traps run into the problem of the trap gem being bad, so... initially I thought of it more as like a mine or trapper character, but I was like, why not try it on totems and we'll see. The one thing is Rain of Splinters is on totems, which is kind of nice. Not as good as you would maybe think, because it only applies to the final part of the initial the main projectile, the eye, but still pretty good, right? In terms of my assessment of the skill, I think it does all right. It could definitely stand to use a few buffs. The clear is pretty good. The boss damage is kind of meh, but you can get it to an acceptable range, and I'll show you that in the map that we're going to be doing. I think one of the main problems is just that it doesn't really excel in one area. Like, you think it would excel in clear, but in reality, a skill like Freezing Pulse in most cases just does its job even better. There are some things that Eye of Winter can do that Freezing Pulse can't when you have Chain on it, clearly, right? You can kind of get some out there mobs, but other than that, it's just in really dense situations where there's hordes of monsters, it's very hard to compete with Freezing Pulse just kind of like pounding through damage on all of them, especially since the damage of the skill is relatively high to begin with, right? Whereas Eye of Winter is kind of low. So, I'll just get into the map here, and I'll let you guys kind of decide for yourself. This is the... Looks like we're a little lagging here. Okay, we have a super big latency spike. Okay, I think we're maybe good. We'll go into the map now. Interesting. Okay. So yeah, we'll go in, we'll show you what's on. The one issue I have, or another issue I guess you could say I have with the skill kind of, is that I feel like the damage profile of the small but rapid multiple hits just isn't really super good, especially with ice skills. Like Barrage kind of being the exception, but only because there's so many hits that do decent quality damage that the overall damage seems very high. We have the wrong gem in. Give me one moment. We have the slower projectiles in. But you get to see it with slower projectiles. You'll see that on the boss, but now you can see it, the difference between slower and faster. You can see it gets quite a bit more coverage, right? But yeah, the smaller hits, individual hits, I don't think they work so well on cold skills in general. Even something like Barrage. Barrage is just a benefit because you can add projectiles to it that will directly always hit the single target, right? Otherwise, it's not, or Ice Spear, sorry, is what I'm talking about. But otherwise, Ice Spear is not really that remarkable. And since there's nothing you can really stack with cold, where like, stacking, the hits don't apply some type of like exposure debuff that stacks up the more you hit them or something like that, you're really just left with a skill where your freeze potential and your chill potential is like greatly diminished. You know what I mean? There's not an obvious advantage to hitting multiple times in quick succession for less damage. And that would be the case even if all these projectiles hit the single target, right?
It's my lucky day.
So, okay, I'll do some expedition here and try and make this a thick
I
one.
always love a good risk.
We got one more, right? I think that's pretty much everything. One thing is, this build does make use of Hydra Spear, but for this particular version of the build, you have to be very careful casting Hydra Spear into packs, and I will explain why a bit later, but basically it still counts as like a hit, and we use a necklace that removes some life on hit to give us an additional chain. You guys are probably familiar with it. So, yeah, you have to be a bit careful there. In a lot of cases, actually, you can still survive it quite easily. And you can always reposition it. So if I do put it, like, let's say this pack here, I put it down, I can just move it behind me like that pretty quickly. So it's not usually a problem. You can kind of put it down, and then if things are not dying and you're starting to take damage from it, you just move it. So it's not the end of the world. And this build actually has a relatively high regen. If you wanted, you can even run a stone golem for additional regen. Right now, we're using a chaos golem, or we were before it died, for additional fizz mitigation. The golem dying is actually kind of a good sign that the freeze capability on the build is not super great, because when you run freezing pulse totems, one of the things that doesn't happen super often is your golem does not die. So, okay, so we're gonna swap in slower projectiles for hypothermia here. Hypothermia is not really what it was, so that's why we picked that one on the swap. It's when you POB it, that's like the least damage lost. So you're gonna lose a little bit of damage like up front, but this helps you kind of like aim the skill much better on a boss for sure, you know, because the margin of error you're having to account for is not as high. The projectile's not moving as fast. It's also kind of tricky when you have a lot of projectile speed, because the totems have an activation range where they can target the mob, right? So if your projectile speed's too high, you won't even be able to place the totem at max range without it shooting a projectile that goes way past the boss, which is what we don't want. So just cutting it down with slower projectiles just makes things a lot easier. We'll get into that here. So I'm going to put a portal down and just get some curses up on myself here. Okay, so we're going to put some totems in a position in front of Hydra. We're going to drop the thing down. The main thing I would say here is, like, try not to worry about getting your Hydra Spear on bosses that move in, like, what you think is, like, the perfect position. It's much better that you just, like, have it on there at all, if that makes sense, right? You can see it does some damage, right? We're not in the Z DPS tier. Taking some hits there.
My mana is spent.
Kind of sloppy play. He's just hiding out with all his orbs. So that's Hydra.
That stretches the sanity of
Relatively chill. I got hit by a couple balls there. But it does decent damage, right? I mean, he had 26% more monster life. Yeah, so not terrible. We'll go back through the map here, and I will pick up the stuff later. So, getting into the build, I think we should start with the Ascendancy. I kind of did the math on doing Inquisitor with this, and I just feel like in a lot of cases, Hierophant kind of comes out on top. especially like even if you wanted to do blood magic or something like that, you would just cut out divine guidance and you would take arcane blessing, and you still get like what is it, 5% more damage from doing that. So 5% more. This comes out to like 30% more, because you're usually going to have 6 totems, 7 if you have a totem shield, so 35% more. And then the power charges are the crit, and then if you run the Dominus Timeless Jewel here, you get 3% more spell damage for power charge, so that's 12% more just from the minimum power charges. So I think it works out like pretty well damage wise, and it really does compete, and it's just the quality of life is there. I just think Hierophant is by far the easiest to go with in this setup. So we went Hyro, and the tree is pretty unremarkable. I do take a shield, so you notice I come into these nodes right here. We're still mana based, so I grab this stuff. I take these nodes because we're trying to get a snake pit in there, which we'll talk about the gearing a bit later, but obviously we need to recover the curse effect some way. So we got 40% here, 10, so 60, then 80, and then we have the Yugal minor god power there, so 100% through that, and yeah, so that's how we reach that threshold. Otherwise, the tree is pretty pedestrian. We use a rain of splinters. I would not suggest over-investing in extra projectiles on this build. But something like rain of splinters, it's very easy to put in there and just get some damage from, right? The drawback is very minor, 33%, not less, but reduced damage is, great for totems. So there's no reason not to have it in there. Basically, it just adds damage to our build if you can kind of get the winter Eye of Winters to explode at the end properly. But definitely don't you don't see me putting GMP in the links, for example, or greater volley or something like that. It's not worth it at that point. You're taking too much of a hit. There's too much of an opportunity cost sacrificing a damage gem. You need all those projectiles to land perfectly, and as you can see with a boss like Hydra that moves, not super great. Now, on a boss that's like more stationary, that stuff becomes more viable. Still think it's probably not necessary, but clearly on the more stationary stuff in the game, adding more projectiles is just going to be straight up more beneficial. Yeah, I don't think there's anything to really say too much about the tree. Get the self-flagnation, and obviously the militant faith. What you can do with this is, you just buy a cheap one and then you divine it a couple times. You get Dominus. It doesn't need to have elemental damage per 10 or totem damage. I would try and get one of those, because most of the time you'll be able to get one of those on like anything. It's just the combination together might be a bit expensive. But that part of it is not really a big deal anyway. You just want it for the inner conviction, and then you're fine. So, yeah. And because we're using a shield, I grab Glancing Blows, which gives me crit multi given the shield that I use. And I grab Arcane Swiftness, stuff like that. If you're not using a shield, don't grab those. You put the points into other damage nodes. So, looking at the gear, kind of a pedestrian wand here. I think this is like 5 to 10 chaos. I love using that. I think it's Takati as the mod from Incursion when I can, especially on things with either high damage effectiveness or a lot of multiple projectiles like this, because a little damage adds up, right? And just a solid wand, nothing too insane, right? Got the shield. Light of Lunaris is a great budget option. Might be a little bit more expensive earlier on, but you can just swap it out with another wand and go shields later. But it's pretty good for what we want to do here for sure, and it's relatively cheap right now. If you do take this, definitely make sure to take again Glancing Blows from the tree, because you're gonna send your crit multi through the roof, because it doubles your block chance essentially. For the rings, you can use a Kikazaru here. What I did is I just bought a cheap Shaper base that was like the appropriate eye level. I think it's 75. to roll the reduced curse effect, and you basically just alt-aug it until you get that, and then you regal whatever you have and craft life, and you're pretty much golden. You can kind of do that until you get something decent. Like, I actually kind of got Chaos Res, which is pretty good. Like, the ring is not bad, right? But it's certainly nothing insane. It definitely doesn't add to our damage or make it easier to clear the map or anything like that. So, good ring overall, but, very easy to replicate this. Or you can just use a Kikazaru. Snake Pit is kind of like one half of the heart of the build, right? Because we want the chain. We have it in the right slot, obviously, for that. We have got the cast speed and the spell damage. Feel free to use, I think it's intrinsic essence on this, or not essence, but catalyst to get the quality up there. So you get a bit more damage on it. Really good damage ring on top of the chain. And, the only thing that sucks is it doesn't have life, but what can you do? You're getting a lot. And the chain's going to be really nice, obviously, for chaining off the ice spear, but also just generally chaining to mobs itself, right? In terms of the clear and stuff like that. The gloves, got these for like 20C. I was using Demon Stitch prior, and the idea was going to be to try and figure out if that would be a good way to sustain my energy shield without having to wait for it to recharge. As it turns out, you just don't really have enough life to make that viable, in my opinion. If I had like 6k life, it starts to look a little better. But it's just not a lot of life. So the energy shield you get back when you sacrifice the 5% life just isn't really what you'd want it to be. And I think it's just way more useful to have gloves like this where you can just... the thing I love about using rare gloves on a build like this is the mod from Incursion again. Incursion has some great mods. 42% increased damage with hits against chilled enemies. That's paired with the cold resist. So you're getting your super high resistance, and you're getting you can get that to 50% damage in one mod. Toss some life on there, and I'm tossing some dexterity to avoid having to spec into it in the tree. And you're kind of golden. So, just get stats where you need them, get resistances where you need them, and just keep in mind, try and get that Incursion mod in the gloves. The belt is pretty good. I actually made this from ROG, but again, any belt that covers your resistances is nice. Chaos Resist is definitely a nice luxury. It just makes you tankier. It's gotten, I think, more necessary as the game has progressed, but still not necessarily super necessary, especially as a totem build, and totem build that can potentially freeze, right? It's not as important as it would be on other builds. So you can definitely get by with just kind of like a normal belt. And boots, just pretty simple boots. I think I got these for like 15 chaos. Nothing too crazy. Just cover your resist, get movement speed, etc. The lab enchant you want for these is the penetration one. You can also use the crit one, or even the lightning damage one, if you're having a hard time getting a specific enchant. So that's nice. And Gloomfang. So this is the thing where you want to be careful with your Hydra Spear, because your Hydra Spear actually counts as a hit. So, you will incur the 14% life for each enemy hit. So if you cast it into a huge pack, you're kind of taking a lot of damage. It doesn't necessarily pulse like super, super quick, so you're not really going to instantly die, but you can feel it. You can see your health going down for sure. If that happens, like I said, if let's say the pack is on Alva here, so I put my orb down, I'm taking a ton of damage, you just, move it away. You can do that, reposition it. What I like to use Hydra Spear for outside of bosses is kind of like on the periphery of a battle, or you can use it to kill kind of like high health rares that are not surrounded by a ton of mobs, essentially, which, is going to be the case most of the time, because when you put your totems down, they're going to clear a lot of like the white and blue monsters, and then you're kind of going to be left with like a mix of maybe blue monsters and yellow. And at that point, it's really safe to use it to kill the rares, because even if it's hitting mobs, it's costing such a minuscule amount of your health compared to the regen you have that you're going to be absolutely fine. And, obviously, it's kind of huge damage for projectiles that have chained. So in a bossing situation, when those projectiles that aren't hitting the boss, that are kind of initially, that are getting roped back in with the chain, have 40% of their non-chaos as extra chaos damage, which is pretty good. The problem is that each individual projectile itself isn't doing a ton of damage, right? So I guess that's a bit of the downside. And obviously, like, you're probably not roping a ton of projectiles back in, but it's definitely like a really great budget option for this build. This is another one you want to use the poison catalyst. I think it's Noxious on to bump up that the damage, the non-chaos is extra damage, and it gives mana regen, which is always nice. Projectile speed and the chain itself is nice for clear. And again, not so nice for the bosses, but when you put in slower proj, it really doesn't matter that you have that 30% projectile speed because it cuts it down so much anyway. So you're basically fine. As a matter of fact, the 30% projectile speed of anything probably puts it closer to the sweet spot that you want. It might be a little short if you had no projectile speed at all and you were trying to run slower projectiles. So just something to keep in mind there. Then the helmet, I crafted this with essences. That's how I recommend everybody craft their helm if you're just starting out. Fossil craft obviously is more damage, but essences are super cheap. You're probably going to have a bunch of them just from playing the game. Just use a resistance essence on there is my first inclination, and try and get like a high life roll, or in this case a hybrid roll where you can craft the remaining life on. And if that doesn't work out, then you can just use a screaming essence for life. But yeah, I just used like a screaming cold resist essence and got this, so it's pretty nice. I think that the shard frequency is probably the best one you could get. The others are pretty bland, just like a bit of extra damage. I think the other one's like cast projectile speed, so it's probably between this or the damage, and I figured this probably has maybe a bit more potential to help with the clear. So yeah, I grabbed this. Not the end of the world if you can't get this enchant. I've used it with and without. I don't think it makes a super noticeable difference, but it's easy enough to pick up because these are cheap because it's not a super popular skill. So yeah, and I think that pretty much rounds out the gear. Obviously we got a 5-link soul mantle. Having one white socket in it is not terrible. Obviously you don't need that at all, but I guess actually you don't really need to, because hypo is the same color as a slower projectile, so you can easily just swap that out on a normal 5-link. So the links are increased critical strikes, cold pen, multiple totem, eye of winter, and slower projectiles, or hypothermia when you're clearing. I just POB'd did the math on the 5-link that way, and this was the most optimal setup to run. So that's what we're running. Like I said, probably not worth to use greater multiple projectiles or greater volley or something like that, because again, the projectiles only come out from the last explosion of the orb. So yeah, not the best there, not the best value there. In terms of flasks, just run Panicked of Staunching, pretty standard. Sapphire of Heat, Quicksilver of Adrenaline. This is just to shore up chaos resist a bit, and then a diamond flask, obviously for a bit more damage. Obviously if you have a dying sun, it doesn't hurt to put it in there, right? Probably put it in place of this. You could use a wise oak in place of this. Feel free to put whatever flask you want in there. In my opinion, flasks right now, clearly, except for certain ones, have lost a lot of power. So it's basically just about shoring up certain weaknesses that your build might have in terms of ailments and stuff like that. So that's why we have the freeze immune flask here and the bleed immune flask, and this one for poison. And if you wanted one for ignite, you could do that too, but I don't really have my diamond flask rolled super well. But yeah, that's the flask setup. And yeah, so that's pretty much a lot of the stats in the build. In terms of the positioning, we'll run through the links and then I'll talk about the positioning. So I use increased AoE, increased duration on frostbite. Ideally, you could have a sniper's mark and a frostbite if your dex is high enough, but a lot of times it's going to be hard to get your dex high enough where you don't have to put points into the tree. So it's just going to be a calculation here in your mind of whether or not it's worth it to do that damage-wise, or if the points in the tree could be better well spent getting you damage that's going to be active all the time. Even if you do run a sniper's mark for bosses, it's still nice to run a frostbite, because since we're a totem build, we're not having to continually cast something, so we have a lot of free time on the move. It's very easy to throw up a Frostbite there. It's only a 0.5 second cast time, has a long duration and a great area of effect. If you want the cast time to be shorter, you can even put faster casting in. But it's definitely a big damage boost, and you get more curse effect on things that aren't bosses, right? So it's even more effective against normal magic and rare mobs. So I like having a Frostbite I can just kind of toss out there like that. Same thing with Frost Bomb, same idea. Just more Cold Pen, never hurts. You can just toss these into packs from kind of like off screen or a distance, and it's really, really nice. So that's what I like to do. Something about Sniper's Mark, I know some people are probably curious. Does Sniper's Mark provide more damage? Well, Sniper's Mark, in most cases, should always provide more damage in the sense that the damage taken it puts on the mob from projectiles, assuming you're using a projectile skill, is just going to be more damage than the Cold Pen. And the reason for that typically is because you have other sources of Cold Pen, right? So there's going to be a bit of a diminishing return there, where like the more Cold Pen you stack, the less effective it's going to get. So the Sniper's Mark should generally always be more effective damage. However, you're not getting anything from the projectile split on Sniper's Mark, because I actually looked into this to make sure, because otherwise, if that was the case, we were going to get single target damage from those projectiles, you would have to use Sniper's Mark, because it would just afford you so much more damage. But as it turns out, when a projectile splits, it still is the original project. It's still counted as the original projectile. So if a projectile hits the Hydra, for example, and then we have Sniper's Mark on the Hydra, so it splits off, and let's say one of those goes into my Hydra Spear and then gets chained back, it doesn't matter, because it already hit Hydra once, it can't hit Hydra again. So you're not going to get that type of shotgunning damage from Sniper's Mark. It's just going to be a little bit more raw damage, obviously, because the damage taken is better than the minus cold res. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that marks don't get Doom, I believe, and curses do get Doom. So towards the end of the curse is going to be like more effective than it might show in the POB, unless you have the Doom put in on the calculation. Just something to keep in mind there. But yeah, you could also just go Frostbite like this and save the dex requirement and a lot of headache. So that's what I've done in this situation. Frost Bomb, increased area of effect, increased duration, faster casting, pretty self-explanatory. Chaos Golem, Zealotry, you could toss in an Enlighten in here, but they're super expensive right now. You could use any Golem you want. I just figured the extra Fizz reduction is nice. Hydra Sphere, Steel Skin, Righteous Fire, and increased duration. Only thing you really need on Hydra Sphere is increased duration, because you can't increase the size of it. You can only increase, I believe, the thing it does to like other mobs, like the splash it does when it's triggered, but it won't actually like affect the size, I believe, of the hitbox on the Hydra Spear, which is kind of what we're looking for if we were to use AoE on it, so you don't need it on there. And then we got Flame Dash, Second Wind, Arcane Surge, and increased duration. So obviously, just trying to get more charges here, trying to pump up our mana so we get a higher level Arcane Surge. I think it's like 10 or 11. Yeah, 10. So it's pretty good. And yeah, those are the links. And I think that, we're going to cover the positioning. That's what I wanted to do before we close. So there's a couple different methodologies I've heard. Some people are like, put the Hydra Spear on the boss. So if the boss is Alva, you put the Hydra Spear right on the boss. Now, my problem with that is that ideally your projectiles should be exploding inside the boss, right? So if they're exploding inside the boss, there's not really much that the Hydra Spear is going to be catching, aside from some of the projectiles that come out when they're super close to the boss, right? It might rope, like if I'm here and where Navali is and I cast straight forward into Alva, you might get some projectiles from around here that go into the orb that would have missed the boss and get chained back in. But, for the most part, all the ones at the end that exploded from the orb are already hitting the boss, ideally. So I don't know how I feel about that one. another methodology, which I think is definitely better, is you place the Hydra Spear in between where you're casting and the boss, right? So you'd put it like here, and the idea is that the Hydra Spear is traveling, and as it's traveling, all the projectiles that wouldn't be hitting on the way to the boss are getting chained into the boss, like as it travels into the boss. And then ideally, again, you're still hitting the boss with the eye and getting as much collateral damage there as possible from the individual projectiles. Now, the problem with totems is that you don't have, again, as good control over the aim because things are being automated, right? And especially if the boss is highly mobile, it can be a problem. And typically, this is more the case if you have slower projectiles not in, but even with slower projectiles in, you can kind of get a case where you're overshooting the boss a bit. So your eye is kind of going beyond the boss. So something that I've done is if I feel like that's what's happening on a particular fight, I'll try and place the Hydra Spear behind the boss, right? And then the thought process there is that the eye is going to explode behind it, kind of like almost inside the orb, and all those projectiles are going to get chained into the boss, right? Now, obviously, sometimes it doesn't work out quite that simply because the bosses are mobile, changing position, etc. But that's kind of the thought process I have if you think that your eye is going to be consistently overshooting the boss. So I'd either put it in front or behind, or somewhere on the periphery, not necessarily directly on top of the boss. I don't think that's really ideal from what I've tested, at least with this particular skill. But if you guys have found differently, let me know in the comments. It's kind of hard to judge with these things in the current state. We don't really get good confirmation on how much of our stuff is hitting, missing, etc. So, yeah, that's kind of my thoughts for how to use Hydra Spear. The main thing is you just want it down in proximity to the boss, right? Like, having it down in any proximity to the boss where it's catching some stray projectiles is better than not having it down. You really do want to be active and at least moving it when the boss moves pretty quickly, because if you don't move it right away, you're losing a lot of potential damage. And the one other thing that I want to cover that's maybe a bit out of the scope of this video, but is in terms of alternate qualities, I think there's definitely potential that it's like the lower angle one, the lower angled spread of the projectiles could be potentially interesting, might make it easier to shotgun some things. But, you know, I haven't really gotten my hands on a 21 of those, so if I do, maybe I'll make another video and update you guys, but I think in terms of budget stuff, you're not going to be looking into that anyway. So, you know, as things stand right now, I think this covers all the bases. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to have a Scorching Ray totem video out probably at some point. Might do an Ice Spear, and I'm going to do another, so Ice Spear totems, Scorching Ray totems, a different version of Freezing Pulse also on the horizon, as well as a different version of Forbidden Rite that's much tankier. That one's not going to be as budget, but it's still not going to be crazy expensive, but not quite as budget as a lot of these. I like to focus on budget stuff because I feel like it's not really, the game's not as fun when you're fully min-maxed, you know? It's like, at that point, there's no challenge. I like trying to make something that it does really good, despite the fact that you don't have the best gear available. So that's kind of like where the fun comes in for me, and that's why I build a lot of budget stuff on this channel. So yeah, thanks for watching, and see you guys next time.